tonight, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana is expected to propose that the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress grant be terminated and be replaced with a family grant. It will be given to heads of households instead of individuals and is said to be outlined in Godongwana's first medium-term budget policy statement on Thursday. While joining us to look further at this story tonight, we are joined by the University of Johannesburg's Dr. Lauren Graham, Siyabulela Mama from the Assembly of the Unemployed, and with the Wits School of Governance, Professor Alex van der Heever. Good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for your time tonight. So much of the difficulty around this proposal of a family grant is that, as it stands, the Treasury has not confirmed anything on record about what they're actually looking into, or even the methodology under which it will be implemented. But perhaps, Dr. Graham, let me begin with you. Your just initial reflections on the fact that this is the direction, seemingly, that the Treasury wants to go in.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. Yes, I think this is the Treasury's response to what's been quite an impressive push from civil society for a basic income grant going to people who are unemployed. And the family grant, as the name suggests, would significantly narrow what currently is in place with the COVID-19 SRD grant. Meaning that far fewer beneficiaries would receive a grant. So from an affordability point of view, it makes sense from a Treasury perspective, but really it really does undermine some of the progressive steps that we've taken as a country to extend social protection, and certainly building on what we currently have with the COVID-19 SRD grant in terms of the reach of that grant would be far preferable. Of course, there are affordability concerns, and I know that Prof. van der Heever would be able to address some of those. But it is in many ways disappointing that it would be quite a narrowly targeted grant that is being put forward as a response to civil society's request for a basic income grant.
Siyabulela, one of the other challenges, of course, is that we don't know what the introduction of this family grant would mean for the other grants that whether it's children or the elderly actually receive under the government administration.
Oh, I think it's clear. I think it says family grant, and I think in some point a head of household will get that, which is quite, I think, patriarchal. Anti-working class and anti-poor. And you'd remember, Kathy, we just came from July, from a very strong violence in July, where the SLD was stopped. And we have been, before that, calling that we need a basic income grant of 1,500. And that's what we need. So that, because there are over 11 million people who are unemployed. So we need a permanent basic income grant, and that's what the Treasury needs to move on and stop austerity. And the problems that we also finding ourselves in is that South African government, especially Treasury, they want to extend this social support, but they're not consulting the people who are meant to receive these things. All you see is government consulting technocrats, researchers, and NGOs, which is a quite problematic thing about this government, and it says a lot about the character and attitude of this particular government towards the working class. So what we need is not a family grant, but a basic income grant for all unemployed people and precarious workers.
Professor van der Heever, when it comes to this idea of streamlining the grant process, again, very little detail that we're working with from an officially confirmed perspective, but what in your mind would that mean?
Well, this particular proposal from a technical perspective, is a very, very poor one. The family grant going via a head of household is an abstraction of our understanding of households in South Africa. And the idea that somehow distributing through a so-called head of household is going to actually have equity implications is just unbelievably crass. The other concern with it is that if it is done purely for financial resource constraint reasons, then you're also creating a grant which is going to absolutely exclude some people who would have qualified in the case of the SRD grant, the COVID grant, who would have qualified on equal terms with somebody else, but are absolutely excluded because they don't qualify for this grant. We have no idea how households would actually be identified and prioritized and means tested. There's no system that can do it at this point in time. We can administer an individual grant, but we can't do a family grant. So and a further issue, I'd say, because Siya's correct, I mean, the government has been following technocratic processes of engagement, and I'm one of them. And the issue is that I'm only one of them because this is the process that is currently carried out. What we require in terms of the Constitution and the way we understand our society today is we have to have deliberative processes of engagement on major social policies, not 3 people in the Treasury, or 1 in the Treasury and 1 in the Presidency. It's got to be a social engagement. That's what we have to do over those areas where we have basic fundamental rights in question. And we don't have that process equal to that, and it's why we're getting such bad policy out of it. And I'll make maybe one final comment, which is, I think that the Minister of Finance apparently has in his mind the assumption that he can somehow generate employment with budget, which you cannot do. We have such fundamental structural unemployment in South Africa. At this point in time, we can only mitigate it. We cannot eliminate it with government allocations. Government can introduce infrastructure programs if they can ever get them off the ground properly and maintain the infrastructure. But at this point in time, we have millions of people in dire hardship. We've got to basically continue with the SRD grant, build that platform, institutionalize it, and basically expand our system of income protection, while we, on a complementary basis, introduce other measures in government to improve economic growth and stability. But what we can't do is try and discount our obligations to protect people from income poverty.
And Dr. Graham, that seems to be one of the big issues about this family grant, that in many ways it seems that government is trying to take the short way out of what is a very complex problem and undoubtedly will need to be costly if it is to be implemented and reach people at the point of their need.
Absolutely. What we're reading at the moment coming out of Treasury is that it's going to be very narrowly targeted to those who are living below the food poverty line, which means that it will exclude large numbers of people. And the food poverty line is an extreme poverty line. We really should be looking at the upper bound poverty line, which is a much more realistic targeting measure, or where we would want to see people living. And that's just about 1,300 a month. The other challenge, of course, is that when we're talking about grants and whether grants, one of the objectives supposedly is that having these grants would stimulate economic activity, people going out looking for work or investing in livelihood strategies. But the evidence tells us that that really only happens if a grant is above a certain threshold. And if we're targeting it at families or households where they're below the food poverty line, and it's a small amount, we're definitely not going to be getting above that threshold to stimulate economic activity. There's a lot of research going on now looking at how the COVID-19 grant is being used, and we know that it's used largely to meet household needs. So in effect, our individual grants are used as household grants. The income is pooled in a household to ensure the better well-being of that whole household, children in particular. And then there's a number of pieces of research going on looking at the economic activity that comes out of that, particularly informal trade and sustainable livelihoods. But that, as I said, really only happens when grants are above a certain threshold that allows people to not only meet their basic needs, but have a small amount of money to invest in other livelihood activities. So what we're putting on the table now really isn't going to achieve those objectives, despite the idea of a design of the cash plus other interventions, which really should be part of our, and is in our policy already, should be part of our grant system anyway, whether it's individual or family grants.
Sure. Sia, what are the dangers of not having a social security protection system that actually extends to the majority of those who need it, especially when we look at things like the youth unemployment rate in this country? And you referenced some of the events in July, which of course would be a huge contributing factor as well.
Yeah, look, and there's this often cited statistics of every week in South Africa, over 10 million people go to bed hungry. And of those, 3 million are children. And it tells a picture and the need for these social support grants. Look, and then I've also made a reference about what happened in July, but there's also in what we began to saw during these elections about people not believing in this system, and especially in the electoral system, because these are linked. The youth did not register. Many people, over 10 million people, did not register to vote. And it's because of these issues. So what we're saying to Treasury, stop austerity, implement a basic income grant of 1,500. And it's interesting now that there's this 8.5 billion that is coming to finance a just transition. And that's a loan. Interesting, and that will create more austerity. It will create more austerity. We'll see more budget cuts. While the government is supposed to be introducing taxing the rich, progressive wealth tax. There's a plethora of evidence that if you tax the rich between 3 and to up to 7% of the rich, about 165 billion could be raised in revenue annually. I mean, now there's a case between Lonmin and AMCU that Lonmin is taking away over 4.5 billion outside through profit shifting.
Sure.
And government needs to stop those things and to finance a basic income grant. So we do not take the austerity arguments and family grants as a way of extension to the austerity budgets. We do not take that. We need a basic income grant.
Professor van der Heever, let me wrap up with you then. What happens on Thursday if the minister goes ahead and tables this proposal as part of his medium-term policy budget statement?
I think government will be in trouble if they do that, because they have not. I don't think that it is appropriate for the finance minister to announce social policy of this nature, and they should have gone through a proper process of engagement with society. So I would regard this as something that would have a very quick backlash. They haven't done the technical work, and the technical work for implementing such a grant is administratively it's not feasible, which means that effectively you would be terminating the social relief of distress grant at the end of March, and government will have to take the political hit for that, because it will be big, and I tell you, there will be no support from technocrats, from economists, from civil society. Government will basically have to face the subsequent conversation, and it will be a very severe one.
Professor Alex van der Heever, he's with the Wits School of Governance, Dr. Lauren Graham with the University of Johannesburg, and Siyabulela Mama from the Assembly of the Unemployed. Thank you all for your time in this conversation tonight.